Hello, everyone. I hope you're feeling well and having a peaceful day. Today, we're going to explore a quiet countryside story that begins gently, but soon turns into a tense fight between love and danger, where one man's past mistakes threaten the safety of the people he cares about most. Will he be able to protect a child and the home that became his refuge before it's too late? If you enjoy emotional and suspenseful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming videos. The morning air in the pomelo garden always smelled the same: cool, damp, and honest. Mist sat low between the trees like a thin white blanket, clinging to the leaves and turning every branch into something soft and silver. The kind of morning that made you breathe slower without noticing. Diep stood at the doorway of her small house with a cup of warm water in both hands. Her fingers wrapped around the glass as if she could hold the heat long enough to keep the day gentle. Inside, little Nee slept on a thin mattress near the wall, curled into herself like a kitten. Her hair was messy, her cheek pressed into the pillow, her breathing quiet and steady. Diep watched her for a moment, then turned her eyes toward the yard. There was nothing dramatic about Diep's life, not on the surface. She woke early. She cooked simple food. She worked in the garden. She raised a child who was not hers by blood, but felt like hers in every other way. And yet, lately, Diep had been living with something she couldn't name, a feeling that sat behind her ribs like a small stone. Because of James. James had entered their world like a stranger who didn't mean to stay, then somehow kept returning, again and again, until his footsteps felt familiar on the dirt path outside the gate. He wasn't from here, not truly. People called him CEO James, half as a joke, half as a warning, because he carried that city weight in his posture, the kind of man who had meetings, schedules, responsibilities, and a life that ran on minutes instead of seasons. But when he came to Diep's house, he didn't talk about business. He sat on the wooden stool in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, watching Nye eat with the patient attention of someone learning to be gentle again. Diep never asked why he came, and James never explained. They simply allowed the quiet to become normal. That morning, Diep lit the stove. The fire caught slowly, crackling under the pot. The kitchen smelled like smoke and rice, the way it always did. She moved carefully so she wouldn't wake Nye too soon. Then she heard it. A car. Not a motorbike. Not a neighbor's small truck. A car. Diep's hand paused mid-motion, fingers still holding the lid of the pot. In the countryside, cars didn't come often, especially not to her house. The sound grew closer, tires pressing over gravel, then slowed, then stopped. Diep stepped to the doorway. A black sedan sat outside her gate, clean enough to look out of place among the wet dirt road and the patchy grass. The engine was still running. Then the door opened. James stepped out. But he didn't look the way he usually looked when he came here. His face was tight, like he hadn't slept. His eyes carried something heavy. Fear, maybe, or urgency. He shut the car door softly, but his movements were stiff, like he was trying not to make the world notice he was shaking. Diep's heart sank. She didn't call his name. She simply waited as he walked toward her. When he got close enough, his voice came out low. Diep. Just that. Her name. Like he was asking for permission to speak. Diep glanced behind him, toward the car. Someone else stepped out. An older woman, dressed neatly, hair tied back, eyes sharp and tired. And then an older man. Broad shoulders, formal shirt, the kind of posture that made people stand straighter even from a distance. Diep recognized them immediately, though she had only seen them once before, from far away. James's mother. James's father. Diep's throat went dry. James's mother looked at the house like she was reading a story she didn't trust. Her eyes moved from the doorway to the stove smoke to the small yard, taking everything in with quiet judgment. James's father stayed silent, gaze fixed on James more than on Diep, as if James was the real mystery here. Diep forced her voice to remain steady. "Why are you here?" she asked, but she was looking at James, not them. James swallowed. "I need to talk," he said. "Not inside the city, not on the phone." Diep felt that stone behind her ribs grow heavier. From inside, a small, sleepy voice drifted out. "Auntie?" "Ly." Diep turned quickly. Ly was sitting up, rubbing her eyes, hair sticking up in every direction. She blinked at the doorway, then her gaze landed on James, and her face lit up. "Uncle James!" She sprang up and ran, barefoot, straight into the yard. James's expression cracked for a second. He crouched instinctively, arms open. Ly flew into him like she belonged there. James hugged her tightly, too tightly, for someone who was supposed to be calm. His hand rested on her back, fingers pressing as if he needed to confirm she was real. His mother watched, and in that look, Diep saw something shift. Not warmth, not approval, just recognition. Like she understood in a single moment that this child mattered to him more than he wanted to admit. Diep stepped forward gently and took Ny's hand. "Go wash your face," she told her softly. "Then I'll make breakfast." Ny nodded, still smiling, and ran inside. The moment the door closed, the air changed again. James's mother spoke first. "So this is where you've been coming." Her voice was calm, but it wasn't kind. James's father didn't speak, but his eyes tightened slightly. Diep's hands stayed at her sides, but she could feel her palms sweating. James looked at Diep, then at his parents, then back at Diep. "I didn't bring them here to judge you," he said quickly, like he was trying to protect her. "I brought them because something is happening." Diep's chest tightened. James's mother's eyes narrowed. "What kind of something, James?" she asked. James exhaled slowly, as if saying it out loud would make it real. "My company accounts," he said. "Someone is moving money. Not a small amount. Enough to destroy me if it goes public." Diep blinked. This was the world James came from. Money, power, things that could collapse with one wrong step. It felt far away from her stove smoke and pomelo leaves, but she could hear how serious he was. James continued, "I thought it was a system error. Then I thought it was an employee. But last night, I got a message." "A message from who?" his father asked sharply, speaking for the first time. James's jaw tightened. "I don't know," he said. "Anonymous. They said, stop digging, or the child will disappear again." Diep's blood turned cold. The words hit her like a slap. The child. Ly. Diep's breath caught. James's mother's face changed, only slightly, but enough. "The child," she repeated. James nodded. "They know about Ly," he said. "They know she matters to me." Diep's voice shook despite her effort. "What do you mean, disappear again?" James looked away. A shadow crossed his face, old and painful. Diep had never asked him about his past. Not fully. But she knew enough to understand that James carried a history of loss, something that left him haunted, even on calm days. James's father spoke, voice low. "When James was younger," he said, "a child connected to our family was taken, not permanently, but long enough to scar him." James's mother's mouth tightened. "And we paid," she said bitterly. "We paid and kept quiet." Diep stared at them. Then she looked at James. James's eyes were fixed on the ground. Diep suddenly understood why James held Ly so tightly, why he always looked at her like he was afraid she would vanish if he blinked too long. Diep swallowed. "So, someone is threatening you," she said slowly, "and they're using Ly." James nodded. "I don't know who," he said, "but I do know one thing." He lifted his gaze, and it landed on Diep with raw honesty. "If I stay in the city, it's easy for them to watch me. Easy for them to follow her. Here, it's different. Here, people notice strangers. Here, it's harder to hide." James's mother stepped forward. "Are you saying you want to drag this child into your mess?" she asked, voice sharper now. James flinched. "No," he said quickly. "I'm saying I want to protect her. I want to protect Diep. I want to protect—" He stopped himself, like he didn't want to say us out loud. Diep's heart pounded. She wasn't a businesswoman. She wasn't a fighter. She was a woman who cooked rice and wiped mud off a child's knees. But the fear in James's eyes was real, and the threat was real. James's father looked around the yard, then at the road. "What do you want to do?" he asked. James answered without hesitation. "I want to find out who is doing this," he said, "and I want to do it quietly, without police, without headlines, because if it becomes public, they'll panic and strike." Diep felt a chill crawl up her spine. James's mother folded her arms. "This is exactly why you should come home," she said. "To the city, to safety, to security." James looked at her. "Safety?" he repeated softly. "You mean walls and guards and cameras? They still got close before. They can get close again." His mother's eyes flashed. "And here is safer?" she snapped, gesturing toward the small house. "A wooden door? A stove? A child sleeping on a mattress?" Diep's face burned. Not from shame. From anger, because she could accept judgment about her house. But she would not accept judgment about her love. Diep stepped forward. "My door may be wood," she said, voice steady now. "But my eyes are open. My neighbor's eyes are open. And my heart is not distracted by meetings." James's mother stared at her. James's father watched quietly, assessing. Then James's father spoke again. "Enough," he said, firm. "We did not come here to insult her." James's mother's lips pressed into a line. Diep's stomach churned. From inside, the sound of Ly humming drifted out. She was washing her face, still unaware of the storm outside. Diep looked at James. "What are you asking me?" she asked softly. James's voice lowered. "I'm asking you to let me stay here," he said. "Just for a few days, until I find out who is behind the message." "And if you don't find out?" Diep asked. James's eyes flickered. "Then I'll move Ly and you somewhere safe," he said. "I'll do whatever it takes." Diep's heart clenched. She didn't like hearing her life spoken about like it was something that could be moved like furniture. But she also understood. Fear makes people want control. Diep took a slow breath. "Come inside," she said. James exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for hours. They entered the house. The kitchen was small, simple. The table had scratches. The cups didn't match. The scent of rice and smoke hung in the air. James's mother sat stiffly, like her spine refused to relax in a place like this. James's father sat more quietly, hands folded, gaze thoughtful. Diep placed bowls on the table. Rice, eggs, a small plate of salted vegetables. The kind of breakfast that could keep you going through a long day, but wasn't meant to impress anyone. Ly came in with damp cheeks and bright eyes. She froze when she saw the older couple. James smiled gently. "Ly," he said, "this is my mother and father." Ly blinked, then bowed awkwardly, the way children did when they were trying to be polite. "Hello," she said in a small voice. James's mother stared at her, and for a second, just a second, something soft flickered in her expression. Then it vanished. "Hello," she replied. Breakfast passed in strange silence, broken only by Ly's small questions about whether the pomelos were ripe yet. Diep watched James carefully. He ate, but he barely tasted. His eyes kept shifting to the window, to the road, to the corners of the house like he expected danger to walk in at any moment. After breakfast, James stood and stepped outside to take a phone call. Diep watched him from the doorway. James's father approached quietly, standing beside her. "You are brave," he said, not as praise, but as statement. Diep didn't respond. James's father continued. "My son, he carries guilt," he said. "He doesn't talk about it, but it shapes him." Diep looked at the older man. "Guilt for what?" she asked. James's father's eyes hardened slightly. "For trusting the wrong people," he said. "For believing money could solve everything. For thinking power could protect what he loved." Diep's breath felt tight. "So why are you here?" she asked him. "To take him away? To stop this?" James's father shook his head. "I'm here because I have seen what happens when we ignore threats," he said, "and because I no longer trust the people around my son." Diep's stomach dropped. "You think it's someone close to him?" she whispered. James's father's gaze met hers. "Yes," he said simply, "and that is why this is dangerous." That afternoon, the sun rose higher and burned off the mist, but the air stayed cold. Diep went about her chores, but her senses were sharp. Every sound from the road made her pause. James stayed near the house, working from his phone, making quiet calls. Sometimes he looked like himself, calm, controlled. And sometimes his hand would tremble when he thought no one was watching. Ly played in the yard with a small ball, laughing, unaware, until the late afternoon when a motorbike slowed near the gate. Diep's heart jumped. A man stood beside the road, helmet on, face half covered by the shadow of the trees. He didn't enter the yard. He didn't call out. He simply raised his phone and pointed it toward the house. Diep's blood ran cold. She stepped forward instantly. "Hey!" she shouted. The man hesitated, just a fraction. Then he turned his bike around and sped away, tires spitting dirt. Diep ran to the gate. James appeared behind her fast, eyes sharp. "What happened?" he demanded. Diep pointed down the road. "He took a picture?" she said, voice shaking. "Of the house." James's face went pale. James's mother stepped outside, eyes narrowed. "Did you see his face?" she asked. "No," Diep whispered. "Helmet." James's father's jaw tightened. "That's not random," he said. James looked at the road like he wanted to chase the man, but he didn't. He stayed, because Ly was behind them, now watching with confusion. "Uncle James?" she asked softly. "Who was that?" James forced his voice calm. "Just someone lost," he said, kneeling to her level. "Nothing to worry about." But Diep saw his eyes. He was lying. That night, Diep locked the doors twice. She placed a chair against the back door, like it could do anything. She put Nee to sleep close to her, on the same mattress. James slept on the wooden bench near the front room, refusing the bed. "I need to hear the road," he said. Diep didn't argue. The house went quiet. Only the crackle of the dying stove and the distant sound of frogs in the wet fields. Diep lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her mind kept replaying the image of the motorbike man, a picture of the house, a warning. Then close to midnight, a sound, soft, a tap, not on the front door, on the side window. Diep's entire body froze. James was awake instantly, silent as a shadow. He moved toward the window, one hand raised, signaling Diep to stay still. Nye stirred beside Diep, mumbling in sleep. Diep's heart hammered so hard she thought it would wake the child. James reached the window slowly. Another tap, then a low whistle, short and deliberate. James's face tightened. He turned and mouthed, "Stay with her." Then he stepped quietly toward the door. Diep grabbed his sleeve, eyes wide. "No," she whispered. James leaned close. "If they want me, I can lead them away," he whispered back. "If they want her, I need to know." Diep's throat burned. She didn't want him to go, but she also understood. Sometimes you have to face the threat before it enters the room. James opened the door, just a crack. The night air rushed in, cold and sharp. Then a voice, low, masked by the darkness. "Come alone," it said, "or the child is next." Diep's blood turned to ice. James's shoulders stiffened. Diep saw his jaw clench so hard it looked painful. He stepped outside. Diep wanted to scream, to stop him. But she stayed inside, arms around Nye, pressing her hand over the child's mouth gently so she wouldn't wake and cry out. James's footsteps moved across the yard, then silence. For one long moment, Diep heard nothing but her own heartbeat. Then, a sudden crash, a grunt. James's voice, sharp. "Who are you?" Diep's body moved before her mind could decide. She grabbed the kitchen knife, not because she wanted to hurt someone, but because fear makes you hold something. She rushed to the door. Outside, under the faint moonlight, she saw two figures. James was struggling with a man in dark clothing. Another man stood near the gate, watching. James's mother and father burst out behind Diep, shock on their faces. James's father shouted, "James!" James's mother screamed, "Stop!" The man near the gate turned, then ran. James slammed the other attacker into the ground. Diep saw it clearly now. The attacker's face was partially uncovered, and Diep recognized him. Not from the city, from the countryside. A man who had once come to buy pomelos. A man who had smiled too easily, asked too many questions, and left without buying anything. Diep's stomach flipped. The attacker struggled, then hissed through clenched teeth. "You should have stopped digging," he spat at James. "You think you're smart? You think hiding here changes anything?" James's eyes burned. "Who sent you?" he demanded. The man laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You already know," he said. James's face tightened, then the man's gaze shifted to the doorway. To Nye. Even in the dim light, Diep saw the hunger in his eyes. A predator's focus. Diep stepped forward instinctively, knife raised, standing between him and the child like her body was a wall. James's mother froze, seeing the blade. James's father moved closer, voice steady. "Call the police," he ordered, pulling out his phone. The attacker's expression changed. He twisted suddenly, ripping free from James's grip with desperate strength, then lunged toward the road. James sprinted after him. Diep's breath caught. James's father grabbed Diep's arm. "Stay inside," he said firmly. But Diep couldn't, because James was chasing a man into darkness, and darkness was where accidents happened. Diep ran to the gate anyway, clutching the knife. James disappeared down the road, feet pounding. Then a flash of headlights. A vehicle, small, fast, waiting. The attacker jumped inside. James reached the car just as it began to move. For a terrifying second, James grabbed the door handle, dragged forward, feet slipping on gravel. Diep screamed, "James!" James's father shouted, "Let go!" James didn't. The car swerved, trying to shake him off. Then brakes, hard. The car stopped suddenly. The door flew open, and another figure stepped out. A woman. City clothes. High heels that didn't belong on that road. Her face was hidden by the glare, but her voice cut through the air like a knife. "You really never learn, James." James froze. Diep felt her blood drain, because James's face turned into something she had never seen before. Not fear, not anger, something closer to heartbreak. He whispered her name like it tasted bitter. "Mai." Diep didn't know who Mai was, but she knew, instantly, that this was personal. Mai stepped closer, smiling coldly. "I told you," she said. "Stop looking. Stop asking questions, or you'll lose what you love." James's hands clenched. "You were inside my company," he said, voice shaking now. "You were the leak." Mai shrugged. "You gave me access," she said, "because you trusted me." James's mother's voice broke from behind. "Mai?" she whispered, stunned. "You?" Mai turned her head slightly, amused. "Hello, Aunt," she said sweetly. "Long time." Diep's mind spun. This woman knew his family. This wasn't some random criminal. This was someone close. Mai's gaze shifted toward the house again. "And the child," she said softly. "So this is your weakness now." Diep's entire body stiffened. James stepped forward, voice low, dangerous. "Don't," he warned. Mai smiled. "You'll do what I want," she said. "You'll stop digging. You'll sign the documents I send tomorrow, and you'll keep quiet." James's father moved forward, voice hard. "You're not taking anything," he said. "Not from my son." Mai laughed lightly. "You still think you have control," she said. "How cute." Then she raised her hand, and from the shadows behind the car, another man stepped out holding something small, a phone. He lifted it so James could see. On the screen, an image, a picture of Nye in the yard earlier that day. Nye laughing, unaware. Diep's stomach turned to ice. Mai's smile widened. "I know where you live," she whispered. "I know what you love." James's face went still, so still it was terrifying. Then he took a slow breath, and in that breath, Diep saw something change, a decision. James turned slightly to his father. "Dad," he said quietly, "call the police. Now." Mai's eyes narrowed. "If you do that," she warned, "you'll regret it." James looked at her. "No," he said, voice calm. "You will." Diep didn't understand. Not yet. But James's father was already dialing. Mai's expression sharpened, realizing something was wrong. James lifted his own phone and pressed a button. A loud sound suddenly came from James's phone. A recording. Mai's voice, her threats, her demands, everything. James had recorded her. Mai's face went pale. "You," she began. James's voice stayed steady. "I came here because I knew you'd follow," he said. "I needed you to reveal yourself. I needed you to speak." Mai's eyes flashed with fury. "You set me up," she hissed. James nodded once. "Yes," he said, "because you threatened a child." The police siren sounded faintly in the distance, growing closer. Mai's face twisted. "Move!" she snapped at her men. The man with the phone hesitated. James stepped forward fast. Diep's heart stopped. But James's father moved too, blocking the road with his body, fearless. Mai stared at him, then spat. "Fine." She shoved her way back into the car. The men scrambled in. The car roared to life. But this time, the police were close enough that the headlights of a patrol car appeared at the bend of the road. Mai's car swerved, trying to escape. But the patrol car blocked the lane. The black sedan braked too late. A sharp crash. Metal on metal. Not deadly, but enough to stop them. The attackers stumbled out, panicked, and tried to run. But the police were already out, shouting, chasing, grabbing arms, forcing bodies to the ground. Diep stood frozen at the gate, shaking so hard she could barely breathe. James walked back toward her slowly, like his legs were finally remembering they were human. His mother rushed to him, grabbing his face with both hands. "James," she whispered, voice breaking. "Are you okay?" James's expression softened, just a little. "I'm okay," he said. Then his eyes lifted past her, to Diep. Diep was still holding the knife, forgotten in her hand. James stepped closer. Diep's voice came out like a whisper. "You knew she would come," she said. James nodded. "I suspected," he said quietly, "but I wasn't sure until tonight." Diep's throat tightened. "You put us in danger," she said, and her voice cracked. James's face filled with regret. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "I swear. I tried to minimize the risk, but I couldn't let her keep controlling me." Diep swallowed hard. Nee's small voice suddenly came from behind Diep. "Auntie, what happened?" Diep turned sharply. Nee stood at the doorway, eyes wide, terrified. Diep rushed to her, kneeling, hugging her tightly. "It's okay," Diep whispered. "It's okay." Nye's small hands clung to her shirt. "Uncle James?" Nye whispered, peeking over Diep's shoulder. James approached carefully, kneeling a few steps away so he wouldn't scare her. "I'm here," he said softly. "I'm right here." Nee's eyes filled with tears. "They were shouting," she whispered. "I was scared." James's voice broke. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." He held out his hand slowly. Nye reached out and took it. And in that small gesture, something in the air loosened, like the night finally exhaled. Later, when the police had taken statements and the road grew quiet again, Diep sat at the table with a cup of tea that she wasn't drinking. James sat across from her, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. James's parents sat nearby, looking older than they had that morning. James's mother spoke first, voice subdued. "I was wrong to look down on your home," she said quietly, eyes on Diep. "Tonight, I saw what a real wall looks like." Diep didn't answer right away. She wasn't used to apologies from people like that, but she nodded once, small. James's father cleared his throat. "The police will handle Mai," he said, "and we will handle the company mess." James nodded. Then he looked at Diep. "I'm sorry," he said again, softer, "for bringing this to your door." Diep's eyes stung. "You don't get to protect people by deciding everything alone," she said gently, but firmly. "If we are in your life, we deserve the truth." James lowered his head. "I know," he whispered. "I was afraid you'd tell me to leave." Diep stared at him. For a long moment, only the quiet crackle of the stove remained. Then Diep's voice softened. "I won't tell you to leave," she said, "but I will tell you something else." James looked up. Diep continued. "If you want to be here," she said, "then you have to be here fully. Not as a visitor, not as a man running away, but as someone who stands with us. James's throat tightened. He nodded slowly. "I want that," he said, "more than anything." From the corner, Ly yawned, rubbing her eyes. Diep stood and guided her back to the mattress. "Sleep," she whispered. "The scary part is over." Ly's eyes were heavy. "Uncle James will stay?" she murmured. Diep glanced toward the table. James answered softly, voice warm. "Yes," he said. "I'll stay." Ly smiled faintly and drifted back into sleep. When Diep returned, James's mother watched her with different eyes now. Less judgment, more respect. James's father stood. "We should leave at sunrise," he said to his wife. "Let them rest." James's mother hesitated, then nodded. Before she walked out, she turned to Diep again. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for protecting them, for protecting my son too." Diep's chest tightened, but she simply nodded. After James's parents left to sleep in their car for the remaining hours until dawn, Diep and James sat in the kitchen in silence. The night felt different now. Not safe yet, but calmer. James finally spoke, voice low. "Do you ever get tired?" he asked. "Of being strong?" Diep looked at him. "Yes," she admitted. James nodded slowly, like he understood more than he was saying. Diep stared at the small flame under the kettle. Then she said softly, "But I get tired less when I'm not alone." James's eyes lifted, and in that moment, the city man with the heavy shoulders looked like someone who had been starving for exactly those words. Outside, the mist began to return. Morning was approaching. The world would continue. Pomelos would grow. Rice would cook. Children would laugh. And wounds would slowly close the way they always did, quietly, day by day. And inside the small house, where the door was wooden and the stove smoke smelled like home, the story did not end with loss. It ended with something simpler, a promise. Not loud, not dramatic, just real.